He's a retired prosecutor from Washington, D.C., specializing in prosecuting violent crimes and murders. His first case was a particularly brutal murder of a mother and daughter. That case was solved in part, one of the first cases in Washington, D.C., solved almost entirely by DNA. He's here to talk about prosecuting these crimes, the dangers, becoming an author, and more. Welcome to the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show. In the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show, we are joined by special guests talking about their experiences, the realities of investigating crimes, plus those that have experienced horrendous trauma. Police, first responders, military, and victims of crime share their stories. Hi, I'm John J. Wiley. In addition to being a broadcaster, I'm also a retired police sergeant. Be sure to check out our website, letradio.com, and also like us on Facebook. Search for the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show. You can find us on Facebook. Just search for the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show and be sure to click like. Contact us from Northern Virginia. We have Kevin Flynn on the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show. Kevin is a retired prosecutor, a federal prosecutor, prosecuted successfully violent crimes and murders in Washington, D.C., and he's also author of two books. One is called Rock Creek. The other one is first book, Relentless Pursuit. You can get more information about those at kevinflynnauthor.com. Kevin, thanks for being a guest on the show and for your service. Both very much appreciated.
Well, thank you for having me on the show, and thank you for your service, too, as well, Jay.
And by the way, Baltimore and Washington, D.C. are only about 40 minutes apart. It's not 45 if you're bad traffic. It's really bad traffic, like on the BW Parkway. You could be there for like hours and hours, but they're worlds apart. In Baltimore, we had assistant state's attorneys. In D.C., it was different because you guys are not a state, so you had federal prosecutors. I never knew what to call you guys.
Well, you know what, we called ourselves federal prosecutors because of that's what we are or were. That's what I was in the U.S. Attorney's Office. But because D.C. isn't a state, we handled not only federal crimes like carjackings and terrorist incidents and things like that, but there was the local side of the office that handled the kinds of cases that a local district attorney's office would handle, rapes, murders, shootings, things like that. And so that was one of the things that appealed to me the most about the job when I entered it in 1987, was the fact that I was going to be working for the Department of Justice, which was an institution that has the resources at its disposal and prestige and certain things like that. But most importantly, was that I was going to be able to handle the kinds of cases that are, to me, the most interesting and affect the community, the community that I served the most deeply. And so that sort of hands-on street crime experience was invaluable to me.
And there's a big difference in, there's different branches of law. And when I say guys, I need to clarify this. I say it every episode. That's the terminology we use in law enforcement, and that refers to men and women. We don't really give a hoot about your gender. Never really have. When it came to prosecutors, assistant state's attorneys, whatever it was, you had men and women that did their job, and it was quite the grind. There was, 5 days a week. Sometimes you're handling 7, 8, 9 cases. You got trial preparation. It was never ending for you guys, wasn't it?
It was a demanding job, but my wife, she and I met at the U.S. Attorney's Office. We raised 2 kids who are now both lawyers and both also interested in public service. And so I was able over the years, because of a great home life that I had, but also a thriving work life, to be able to balance both and to be able to sort of be a family man, but at the same time handle a demanding job. But it was a 6-day-a-week job for most of my career.
Wow.
Except on days when one of the kids had a sporting event or there was some family activity on a Sunday, it was pretty routine for me to go in on Sundays as well. The overlap of work from Friday into the weekend was constant. So it was demanding, but a lot of adrenaline. I
think a lot of people really don't appreciate what the prosecutors go through, and the public defenders for that matter either.
That's right. It's whether you're on the side, and I don't want to be sort of like simplistic about this, but whether you're on the side of the victim side or the defendant side, whether you're a prosecutor or a public defender, you're inspired by that. You really, and it makes you put in many more hours, I think, than you might if in my case, if I was just working for a corporate client.
It's a big difference. And the last one, there's actually two things I want to get into. One is, and maybe you can explain it better than me. I somehow think you can. The police are similar, but they're a different jurisdiction, different branch of the government than the state's attorneys or prosecutors. Am I correct?
Yeah, I worked for most of my career. Most of my cases involved the Metropolitan Police Department, which is the D.C. local police. Now, some of my cases did involve the FBI. One of my cases, the last significant case that I worked on before I left the office in 2023, involved the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. But most of my cases, I was working hand to hand with the Metropolitan Police Department, the local police officers.
And the last question I want to ask, and this drives me absolutely bonkers, especially on TV news. They'll say, well, the case doesn't have a smoking gun. It's all circumstantial evidence. And I go, my wife yells at me. She's like, I've heard it before. I've heard it. Almost all cases are based off circumstantial evidence. Am I wrong?
There's one difference. Usually, in the legal terminology and the way that juries are instructed at the end of a trial, is that there are cases that involve direct evidence and circumstantial evidence. And direct evidence is basically eyewitness testimony.
Right.
That's what it comes down to. Circumstantial case is one that does not involve eyewitness testimony. That's really the most basic way to put it. But in the law and in life, there is no difference. A circumstantial case is not considered weaker just because there's not an eyewitness. In fact, some of the strongest cases that I handled.
I'm glad you said that. I was getting ready to ask you that question because we both know that some of the weakest evidence is eyewitness evidence, and that doesn't mean it's not powerful. It just means they're more prone to mistakes than, say, blood, fiber evidence, ballistic evidence, all that stuff.
That's right. There's no doubt about that. And particularly back when I first started prosecuting cases, the whole identification process that the police used was different, and I think arguably less reliable. I had some cases early on that I look back on, and I don't doubt that I got a good conviction, but it was a stranger on stranger eyewitness identification case. I was confident at the time. I still would be confident if I look back on those. But the fact is that if you have a DNA hit off the crime scene, or you have surveillance camera footage that definitively establishes a defendant's presence at a crime scene, or something like that, circumstantial scientific evidence, cell phone evidence, things that type of evidence. If you put all those pieces together, you can make a much more powerful case than, for example, a single witness eyewitness identification case.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just go crazy when they say somehow circumstantial evidence is not as strong, and we both know that is not the case. I want to go into your career a little bit. And here's one of the things I laugh at all the time. When people say they want to be police, they go, yeah, I'm going to college, which is great. And then they go in the academy, which is great. And they're like, and then I'm going right to becoming a homicide detective. And I go, well, it doesn't quite work like that. Is it the same thing with prosecuting violent crimes or murders as a prosecutor?
Oh, sure. Yeah. When I first started out, I handled misdemeanor cases, which for 11 months, and those were basically simple assaults, theft cases, shoplifting, prostitution cases. In fact, I took over my wife's caseload in misdemeanors, and I think I can say this, since a lot of our caseload was shoplifting and prostitution cases. My standard running joke is that I met my wife over stores and whores, but that was invaluable experience. Back then, most misdemeanor cases were jury demandable. The defendant could demand a jury trial. So I had 26 jury trials before I even got out of misdemeanors. Then I went on to do drug felony cases, which were drug distribution cases. went on to do then more complex investigations. I was 3 years in the office before I handled a homicide.
And we're going to take a short break on that note. We'll return our conversation with Kevin Flynn, retired prosecutor, prosecuting violent crimes and murders in Washington, D.C. Don't go anywhere. This is Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show. We'll be right back. Did you know that there are 3 things you can do to dramatically increase your revenue both offline and online? That's one of the things you'll learn at CreativeCon 2025. Plus, meet me, John J. Wiley, the host of the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show and podcast at CreativeCon, located at the fabulous Intercontinental Hotel in Chicago, February 21st through 23rd. You'll learn how to take your business to the next level. CreativeCon 2025 is the ultimate business and networking event. That's CreativeCon 2025 at the fabulous Intercontinental Hotel, Chicago, February 21st through 23rd, 2025. Get more information at CRE8TIVE.com. Again, that's CRE8TIVE.com.
Imagine contacting millions of people every month using Facebook from the comfort of your home or business. How much would you increase the success of your business or service if you could do that? I do that every day, and so can you. Plus, earn a separate revenue from Meta. Learn how to work smarter and not harder on Facebook. Get step-by-step instructions on what to do and what not to do. Start with a free membership. Get details at letbreak.com. letbreak.com. That's letbreak.com.
Return our conversation with Kevin Flynn on the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show. Kevin is a retired prosecutor, prosecuted violent crimes and murders in Washington, D.C. And he's also author of 2 books, Rock Creek and Relentless Pursuit. You can get more information about his books and him at kevinflynnauthor.com. That's kevinflynnauthor.com. Kevin, one of the first cases that you want to talk about is a particularly brutal mother and daughter murder, and that was the topic of your book, Relentless Pursuit. Am I correct on that one?
That's correct. It was I got the case in right within days of the double homicide happening in 1993. It's the last week in May of 93, and just by happenstance, I happened to be on court duty when the case came in off of an arrest, and so I was assigned the case, took the case over, and it's really no exaggeration to say it changed my life. Case happened in the northeast quadrant of D.C. Mother and daughter were, as it turned out, they were killed by, as the judicial process established, were killed by the mother's ex-boyfriend over a child support issue. And they were, when the police first came on the scene, they were detectives on this scene who had been on the force for 25 years and had handled thousands of crime scenes. And I think to a person, they said that this was the worst crime scene in terms of just the gruesomeness and the brutality of it that they had ever seen. Both the mother and daughter had been eviscerated. Her daughter had been stabbed multiple times, and her heart had actually been taken out of her body, and it was never recovered. And this was the scene that the police happened on.
Her heart was removed and never recovered?
Was never recovered.
Wow.
And as it turned out, one of the key pieces of evidence, and we had no eyewitnesses, but one of the key pieces of evidence was the fact that he was a hunter. The killer was a hunter, and a hunting manual was seized by the police in a search warrant on his house, and the hunting manual described the way that a hunter would field dress game, and that manner of field dressing a deer, which is something I've never done, but that manner was mimicked in the way that the bodies were mutilated, were killed. They both of them were killed by way of a Y incision, and then their entrails were taken out as if they were hunted game. So it was a horrible case, and the more we got to know about, the more I got to know about the victims and their families, the the more strongly I was incentivized to do everything I could, working with the police to make sure that
to make it harder for you to. A lot of people, myself included, from time to time, found it to be more difficult once I got to know the victims and they humanized them. Did you encounter that?
No, it's hard. That's kind of hard to say. In this case, it was. I guess I can speak to this case the most strongly because the mother was just she was the center of this large family in D.C. She was the life of every party that she walked into. The daughter had enormous potential. She was quiet, but she was just described as being the most extraordinarily sweet young woman. She was 14 at the time she was killed, so I got to know them indirectly, of course, because I didn't know them in life. What was sustaining for me in that experience was working with the surviving family members who, to this day, the case came in 30-some years ago. Several of them are still close friends of mine, and we stay in touch. But they were just they were so spiritual, they were so powerful. They were so strong. They were just torn apart. But part of my challenge was I needed to basically lead them through each step of the process. That some of them had some skepticism about law enforcement, about the criminal justice system, and so I spent many hours just sitting down with them. One of the victims, the mother's sisters, had a big house out in Maryland, and so this family of literally like 60 or 75 people, we would out there once a month, and I would explain everything to them. It was just easier than getting them on the phone or something like that. And walking them through that process was something that was, in addition, it was, we were mounting a case, we were developing evidence, we were going to court hearings, we were answering defendants' motions and things like that. But at the same time, I would say 50% of my job was basically just keeping them satisfied that in the end we would do everything we could to prove to establish, to get justice for their family members, and that they could trust the system. And as it so happened, I was going through a personal family crisis at the time because my father had been diagnosed with lung cancer, and in fact that lung cancer was proven to be terminal on the first day of the trial. So the convergence of these two things was obviously unfortunate, but they were so strong and they were so spiritual, and so just as I had helped them through the process, the legal process, they helped me through this process. I was sustained by their strength as we were going through this whole ordeal together. So in some situations, you don't get to know the victims, even their families, very well. Unfortunately, I had cases where the family members of homicide victims didn't really care about the process and didn't show up for court, and it was hard to even get in touch with them to get identifying information about, or personal information about the victims.
I don't think a lot of people totally understand that. And I tell people, listen, there are people in Baltimore that I know that I dealt with that have multiple sons that were murdered. Multiple, 2, 3, other ones in prison for long periods of time. And I don't think the average American really comprehends the level of violence. And here's the thing that we'll talk about later on. I've never been a homicide detective. I did make multiple homicide arrests. I did as a patrol officer, patrol sergeant, you name it. The most difficult ones to solve were stranger on stranger murders, but they were the exception to the rule. Usually it was someone that they knew. Right.
Yeah, that was my experience too. A fair amount of domestics over the years I handled, but also gang-related murders. You had drug dealer on drug dealer murders. Oftentimes, I would say, in the majority of cases that I handled, they were not stranger on stranger cases. That was just part of the process.
And one of the things that I think people don't realize too is there's we think of Washington D.C., and I'm as guilty as this as the next person. We think of Washington D.C. as the nation's capital, all the legislation, all that stuff, the White House, you name it. But there's also a very dark, violent side to that city that a lot of people don't appreciate. And there was a period of time, I can't recall exactly when it was, when Washington, D.C. was the number one or number two highest ranked per capita murder cities in the United States. And that fortunately has changed, or has it?
It has changed. It's changed dramatically. It was when I was, when I first got to homicide, I tried my first homicide case in 1990. 1991 in D.C., which is, of course, a city of only about 600,000 or thereabouts. There were 481 murders.
I want people to let that settle in because we're here, short break. 660,000 people, 400 some odd murders. Baltimore is similar as well. We're talking with Kevin Flynn. This is the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show. Don't go anywhere. We will be right back.
What could you do with an extra $500 to $5,000 a month or more? All earned from the comfort of your home or business, and all with Facebook. Meta is paying people just like you every month. They are earning tens of thousands of dollars, and so can you. Learn how to create another revenue stream from Meta and dramatically increase your reach, all without breaking your own time bank. Sign up for a free membership at letbreak.com. letbreak.com. That's letbreak.com.
Remember when news was free? Be sure to check out the Newsbreak app. It's free. And be sure to follow the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show and podcast on the Newsbreak app. Newsbreak is your number one local news app for current events. Free live news for you and your community. Download the Newsbreak app today for free. And be sure to follow the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show and podcast on the Newsbreak app. That's the free Newsbreak app. Be sure to look for and follow the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show and podcast. Return our conversation with Kevin Flynn on the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show. Kevin is a retired prosecutor, prosecute violent crimes and murders in Washington, D.C. He is also an author of two books, Rock Creek and Relentless Pursuit. Get more information about him at kevinflynnauthor.com. One of the things that immediately took me back, Kevin, was you describing the crime scene, and I don't have a point of comparison where it was as ruthless as that one was. All of them are bad. All of them are very, very bad. Some are worse than others. And one of the first things that we say when something is particularly heinous and there's like entrails and organs removed and all that stuff is that it was deeply personal. Was that something that you heard from the police on the scene?
Oh, absolutely. As soon as, really, I mean, it's in terms of various forms of killing. Stabbings are almost always. Well, that might be too much of a generalization, but it is very, very common for stabbings to be committed by people against people that they're close to,
right.
Or were close to, or have some animosity arise out of that closeness. So the first thing that the police on that scene started, considering was the inner circle of the victims, and you look first to the mother because it was more likely that she had some kind of a relationship or had some kind of dealings with someone who wanted to do her harm, and it was apparent fairly early that the 14-year-old was not the main target of the homicide, and the way we pieced it all together at the end was that based on blood stains and DNA evidence on the scene, where handprints in blood were located, things of that nature, that the mother was the main target, and the daughter likely heard what was going on, came downstairs, and then was killed because she was a witness in what had to have been a fit of complete rage on the part of the killer. And so the police started with the investigation with basically just interviewing the closest circle of people. Unfortunately, they were able to locate the last person to be with the victims when they were alive, and that was her son, the mother's son, the brother of the 14-year-old. And even in the midst of, he had been one of the first people to find the bodies, and he had been one of the people who got in contact with the police. And even in the midst of the trauma that he suffered, and just what would have been the worst imaginable experience that somebody can have, he was a hero in the whole thing. He was able to sit down with the police, provide a very rational account, logical account who he last saw his mother and sister with, and that was the ex-boyfriend who had come over. He came back on the scene not long afterwards, but there had been an interval when somebody else could have entered the house, but it certainly made it less likely that happened. The more that the police and I, as we investigated the case, found out about the defendant and his dealings with the mother, and particularly things that he had said of a threatening nature to her about what he would do to her. He made statements in front of other people about how he would retaliate against her if she continued to press him for child support for a child they had in common.
This was over was child support.
It was over child support, and he was somebody who was just philosophically and adamantly opposed to a man having to pay any support whatsoever unless he wanted to. I got nothing good to say about that guy. First of all, he's a killer. Number one. Number two, I paid my child support. We didn't want a divorce, but that's what happened. But I paid my child support, and if anybody else has a problem with that, they can suck an egg. They need to step a plate and do what's the right thing. Yeah, his theory was that he wasn't gonna submit to a court. He would do what he wanted to do on his own, but he wasn't doing what he needed to do, and so she had to take him to court. And so there was a court hearing scheduled for I believe 3 days after from the time that the homicide took place, and that fact ended up being significant. It was what we call a triggering event.
Right.
There are oftentimes in a situation like that, there is something that is coming up that triggers a person to do a crime of violence like this.
And for most people, they don't respond that way. They don't respond violently. They may not be happy about it. They may get mad. They may yell. They may do all sorts of things, but they don't do acts of violence. And one of the things that a lot of people, myself included, even with my years of police experience, Kevin, is I never quite understood that everything that goes along with domestic violence. We saw quite often the end result, and the end result oftentimes was murder, and it was not good. It was horrible.
Yeah, it's in this particular instance, what was interesting. The more I got to know about the defendant was that he was capable of this horrific act of just to even use the word brutality is to minimize what he did. On the other hand, he had been sort of like. He had been a friend to various people in the family. He had been in a relationship with the mother for some years. He had attended their family picnics. They had a nickname for him. They spoke. One of the things that was extraordinary to me about their various family members that I got to know was that they were able to actually say. They were deeply spiritual people, but they were also able to say good things about his good side, even knowing what he had done to their family.
That's tough to do.
Yeah, I met him years later. I actually had a face-to-face with him after the conviction. He was in jail, and I went to see if I could interview him as part of the writing of the book that I wrote about the case. And he walked into the room. He was a kind of a charismatic guy, but I knew. But there was a deadness in his eyes too, and what was lurking in his soul was mirrored by what you saw in his eyes, and that was what he was capable of.
I want to change your direction a little bit. And by the way, good work on this, because this guy was convicted. Obviously, he wouldn't go to jail, and he wrote the book. The book was called Relentless Pursuit, based on that story. And as horrible as it was, and I hate this term. There's really no justice. There's no closure. It's just part of the process. I thank you for doing your end of it. And here's the thing that a lot of people don't get. Oftentimes we know who committed the crime. We suspect who committed the crime, but there's a thing called evidence you got to have. Probable cause to take someone to arrest them, to bring them to court, and quite often that does not exist. And things like DNA that we hear about on TV, it didn't happen all the time. I want to draw your attention to a second case. This was another domestic violence murder where a wife was killed. Can you tell us about that one?
Sure. This murder happened in D.C. again in 1998, 5 years after the Diane Hawkins was the name of the mother, and her daughter was Katrina Harris. So those are the victims' names. I won't use the defendant's name in that case or this one, but in this case, in 1998, a woman named Carol Smith, who was a special needs teacher, she was killed by her husband, who she was estranged from, and they were going through a divorce proceeding. And, you and I talked a few minutes ago about a triggering event. They were in a divorce proceeding, and they had a divorce hearing coming up only 3 days or so after she was killed. In fact, it was Tuesday. She was killed on a Friday. Her body was found on a Sunday, which was Mother's Day. They were supposed to go back to court on Tuesday, and she was also stabbed. She was found in her bed. She had not. Her mother had tried to call her. It was Mother's Day. They had, obviously, she was trying to get in touch to wish her daughter a happy Mother's Day. Couldn't get an answer. Called the D.C. police. Police come on the scene. The scene was all closed up, but when they achieved entry, they found her upstairs in her bed. She had been almost decapitated, and the scene had been, as it turned out, had been staged to look like it had been a burglary. Various items of furniture had been tossed around. There was one particular piece of furniture which was a cabinet, had a series of cabinets, and that piece of furniture had been looted. All the contents were thrown around, clearly to make it look as if this had been a burglary, a stranger on stranger type burglary. And the defendant, who was as I said, the estranged husband of the victim, had set this up such that he had done the murder on a Friday and then had gone about ways to try to establish an alibi for himself. And so when
we'll take a short break on that note. We'll return our conversation with Kevin Flynn, retired prosecutor, prosecuting violent crimes and murders in Washington, D.C., author of the two books, Rock Creek and Relentless Pursuit. His website is kevinflynnauthor.com. Don't go anywhere. More heading away in just a few moments. We'll be right back. If you want to be a guest on the Law Enforcement Talk radio show, simply contact us. It couldn't be easier. You can send us a message on Facebook. Look for and like the Law Enforcement Talk radio show page, or email jay@letradio.com. That's JAY@letradio.com.
Learn how you can be ultra successful on Facebook and possibly earn an income from Meta. Learn how to work smarter and not harder on Facebook. Get step-by-step instructions on what to do and what not to do. Start with a free membership. Get details at letbreak.com, letbreak.com. That's letbreak.com.
Our conversation with Kevin Flynn on the Law Enforcement Talk radio show. Kevin is a retired prosecutor, prosecuting violent crimes and murders in Washington, D.C., author of two books, Rock Creek and also Relentless Pursuit. His website is kevinflynnauthor.com. It's Kevin Flynn, Flynn, author.com. You can get information about him and the two books there as well. Kevin, this case where, again, it's another domestic violence, another murder, and this guy went to a lot of effort to establish an alibi and make it look like a burglary gone bad. I want people to understand something. Daytime burglaries are very common. They usually strike when people are not there. They don't want confrontation with people. Home invasions are different. They are much more violent. When we see the evidence of a burglary, staged burglary, with a particularly heinous crime involving a stabbing and almost decapitation, all that stuff, something doesn't jive right away in my book. Is that what the...
No, that's exactly right, Jay. You hit the nail on the head. So the two aspects of the scene were basically in opposition to each other.
Right.
The two that you referred to. And so, you talked a few minutes ago about the fact that oftentimes police and prosecutors have a good idea of who did a murder, but they can't make an arrest, or they can't do a prosecution because they don't have they don't have probable cause. They don't have probable cause to arrest a particular individual for the homicide and or for the violent crime or for any kind of crime. And that was the case here. All fingers pointed toward this defendant because of what we knew about him, the nature of his relationship with his mother, with his wife, the nature of the killing. But for 8 months, we weren't able to establish what we needed, and the key piece of evidence ended up being a cigarette that was found on the scene. This whole case, which involved a horrific killing in this house, and the evidence all over, various things thrown all over the place, a chaotic scene, but it all came down to something as simple as a cigarette, because one of the officers looked at this, saw this piece of furniture with cabinets, and saw that on top of this piece of furniture was a cigarette where the ash had burned out. The cigarette had burned down, and the ash was out over the edge of the piece of furniture, and made the conclusion right on the scene that was a piece of evidence that needed to be seized and photographed, because what it was consistent with was that whoever had tossed the furniture was the same person who had put down the cigarette, because that ash would have been disrupted if it had been put down before the items were taken out of the furniture. And so, sure enough, and back then we couldn't get DNA results right away. Now you can get DNA results from a lab fairly quickly.
I read somewhere the other day where they can do it almost immediately.
It's
crazy.
It's much different. Yeah, it's much different than it used to be. So we had to wait for months to get this get DNA back, and in the meantime, he was at liberty. He was in the community. Refused to talk to the police, but that's his right. But in the meantime, he was out. We got a DNA hit on the cigarette, and it came back to him. And we ended up getting also DNA hits on various other blood stains that were very minuscule, almost droplets that were on the scene, but that the police had seen fit and had done their job and preserved. And so that was what really broke the case. And we put a number of other things together. We were able to establish that the alibi was false by way of witnesses who didn't back him up, and took the case to trial largely on DNA. But it was also, when I say circumstantial, there were behavioral aspects to him and to the evidence about him. Probably too complicated to go into, but we were able to put together a case that the jury actually, we had to try him twice. The first time, jury came back hung, and they actually came back hung in favor of him. I believe the count was 8-4 for acquittal when we found out. Then we took him to trial again. Developed a different strategy. My theory about trials was always, if you try somebody twice and there was a hung jury the first time, well, then you got to change up strategy the second time.
Yeah, that would help.
There's a saying in tennis: never change a winning game, always change a losing game. And to me, a hung jury to me was the equivalent of a loss. Of course, we can't retry someone who's been found not guilty. We can retry somebody who's been where the jury was hung in their verdict the first time. And so we changed things around, took him to trial the second time about a month after 9/11, convicted him, and he ended up getting a lengthy prison sentence.
That's just two cases out of about how many? About how many murder prosecutions did you do in your entire career?
I tried almost 30, and I investigated hundreds. I'm sure. I never really tallied it up, but between being the lead prosecutor investigator, working with the police on a case or supervising cases, I was a supervisor of homicide cases for many years, and so I was actually supervising other prosecutors doing homicide investigations. I'd say it easily tallies up to the hundreds.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that point up, because we would quite often work with some of the prosecutors, the state's attorney's office, assistant state's attorneys that specialize in violent crime, and go over evidence, and they would give you plans of action. And quite often when you hear cases that go before a grand jury for indictment, I don't know if it's the same way in D.C. as in Baltimore, that's usually cases we worked with the state's attorney.
Oh yeah, we I think one of the myths that folks have about police and it's like an episode of Law and Order. The police have it for the first half, and then the prosecutors have it the second half. But in my experience, the the investigations that worked the best were investigations where we worked hand in hand with the police from really the time that the murder happened, where they were coming to us. The police can do a lot in terms of approaching witnesses and then getting interviews and things like that, but they don't have something that we have, and that is the power of a grand jury subpoena.
Absolutely.
The police cannot compel a witness to just come down to the station and talk to them. We can, by way of a grand jury subpoena. When I say we, it's as if I'm still on the job. Prosecutors can go to a grand jury, get a subpoena for a witness, and if the witness doesn't show up for a grand jury appearance, well then the prosecutor can go to court and literally get a warrant for the seizure or the arrest of that witness who didn't show up. And so most people tend to show up when they're faced with that sort of consequence in the offing. And so we worked in all the cases. I think I worked most effectively. I was in with the police from the beginning. They were in with me, and we were careful. I was always careful not to overstep boundaries. I didn't see myself as a wannabe police officer, and the officers who I worked best with were also they weren't getting into my business.
I want to change roles a little bit. So you eventually made the switch from being a prosecutor to an author. Was that a difficult switch for you?
It wasn't. I wrote the first book in 2000, and I started writing it in 1995. Went through a bunch of drafts, and finally got it published in 2007. But when it came out, I took sabbatical. I took family leave for 3 years, and so I started writing the book actually when I was on a first form of family leave when our second child.
And that would be the book Relentless Pursuit. Am I right?
Relentless Pursuit. I started on one type of leave, so I had some free time on my hands. That's when I started that, and then I started the second book when I was in the middle of a second form of leave, which was a 3-year sabbatical I took when my kids were still young enough for them to appreciate having their old man around the house. And I sort of switched roles with my wife. She had been part-time, and I became part-time. She went back to full-time, and then I went full-time off for 3 years. So when I started writing the second book, which is a novel, and it's called Rock Creek, I had some time. I had time to fill up. I had time to be able to devote to it, and I didn't find it really a difficult switch from being a prosecutor to being a writer, in the sense that I had handled a lot of trials, and every trial is like it's like a short story, or longer trials, or even like novels. And so you're telling a story through the course of a trial in the same way that a novelist tells a story through over the course of a book or whatever. So I was familiar with that, and I had certain sort of things that were part of my experience that made it a little easier for me, I think, to write and to create characters and to create a story with a sense of place than maybe somebody who hadn't had the kinds of experiences that I had.
The two books are called Relentless Pursuit and Rock Creek. You can get more information about Kevin and his books. You can buy the books online at kevinflynnauthor.com. That's kevinflynnauthor.com. Kevin, thanks for your service, and thanks for being a guest on the show. Both very much appreciated.
I very much appreciate being on here, Jay. It's been a great experience.
A huge thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast version of the Law Enforcement Talk radio show, by the way, which is a nationally syndicated radio show. And we broadcast on over 115 radio stations across the United States to more than 44 million combined population. If you like our show, there's two simple things you can do. Go to our website, letradio.com. Add your favorites. Check it often. You can find episodes of the show right there. And the second one involves our Facebook page. It's so easy to find great content, including past episodes of the show. And when you see something that you like, that resonates with you, be sure to share it with your friends. We'll be back in just a few days with another episode of the Law Enforcement Talk radio show and podcast. Until then, this is John J. Wiley. See ya.